My name's Stephanie, I'm in my 30s, and I'm from Pasadena, California. I only mention that because, as a listener, I find it super annoying when people don't make it clear who they are at the start of their stories. In the spring of late 2017, I've been living with a girl named Lyra for 2 years, and she was easily one of the most chill roommates I'd ever had. We'd met through a friend of a friend when I first moved to Pasadena, and I was desperate for a place to stay. Lyra had a spare room and a rent that she couldn't cover alone, so we made it work. At 26, she was only a year older than me, but she had this sort of worldliness and maturity that made our cramped 2-bedroom apartment feel more like a home. She was an artist in her spare time, and she was a good one too. She was always drawing things in her little sketchbook, birds or vines or pretty spiraling shapes, and she was just as creative when it came to home decor. She wasn't a huge party animal either, which was nice because my job at a coffee shop involved waking up at 5:30 in the morning, and I'd keep the coffee pot warm for her in the morning before I headed to work. It was simple, comfortable, like we'd figured out some unspoken rhythm. Then one day, in April of 2017, she sat me down at our kitchen table and told me that she was going to Bolivia for 2 weeks. Her eyes had this spark about them as she mentioned something called an ayahuasca retreat, like she was already halfway there. I didn't know what ayahuasca was at the time. It sounded like some kind of yoga thing, so I just sort of smiled and said it sounded amazing. Then, around a week later, she packed her things and off she went. I wished her safe travels, waved from the window, and figured that she'd return with some epic stories and maybe a kooky souvenir or two. That night, I was alone in the apartment and I googled ayahuasca and learned it was a kind of hallucinogenic tea used in rituals down in places like Peru or Brazil. People drank it with shamans, puked their guts out, and then saw visions of gods or demons or whatever else lurked inside their minds. Users claimed it was supposed to crack you open or release your soul among dozens of other very grandiose statements. And that wasn't my kind of scene. I liked my reality unscrambled and my feet planted very solid on the ground. But for Lyra, it must have sounded like the adventure of a lifetime. She was the spiritual one, always chasing something deeper with stuff like medication, apps, tarot cards, or the cluster of quartz crystals that she kept on the windowsill. And I went to bed imagining her coming back with a tan and some crazy tale about talking to a jaguar spirit. I kept the apartment running for her 2-week absence, and then when she came back, I was ready to hear everything. Lyra texted me saying that she was about to catch a cab home from the airport, and then about an hour later, the door creaked open and she stepped inside with her bag slung over one shoulder. I'd expected her to return looking relaxed and refreshed with obviously a nice healthy tan, and instead, her hair was a tangled, unwashed mess, and her skin looked chalky, like the sun hadn't touched her for the whole 2 weeks. When I asked her if she had fun, she didn't even smile. Lyra dropped the bag by the door and then looked at me, except it didn't feel like she was looking at me, more like through me or past me. In this flat, distant voice, she simply said it was intense, and then she shuffled to her room and closed the door behind her. And that was the first sign that something was clearly off. Lyra had always been very sociable, the kind of person who'd flop down next to me and ramble on about her shift at the bookstore or the new sketch that she was working on. But after her trip to Bolivia, she seemed distant, and I told myself it was exhaustion or jet lag or something like that, but after another Google search I discovered that the retreat might have been rougher than expected, and I read about the purging, the vomiting, and the hours upon hours of feeling like your mind was unspooling, and then thought, geez, no wonder she's acting so shell-shocked. She probably just needed time to settle in, so I figured that I'd give her the space that she needed, but time didn't seem to fix anything. A week passed, but Lyra didn't snap back. She got super quiet, like she didn't answer me if I asked something, but only in short, clipped words, and she never started conversations anymore. Her sketches stopped showing up on the fridge, and the plants that I'd watered while she was gone started to wilt, but it was like she didn't even notice. I started to worry that she might have gotten some bad news or that her trip to Bolivia had gone wrong somehow. But when I asked, Lyra said that she didn't want to talk about it. I figured my suspicions were correct and that whatever it was, she'd talk about it when and if she was ready to. I also figured it'd be a matter of days at most before Lyra started to feel better. But I was wrong, and things only got weirder. For as long as I'd known her, Lyra had always been a vegetarian. She was a great cook. She'd make stir-fries with peppers and tofu or big salads with nuts sprinkled on top. I'd regularly find bowls of fruit on the counter, mostly apples or mangoes, and I loved living with someone who shared my passion for healthy eating. But then, just less than 2 weeks after Lyra got back from her ayahuasca retreat, the raw beef started appearing. And the first time I saw some, I had almost a gaslight moment where I thought, I don't remember buying ground beef. And then, when I realized that it was Lyra's, I think I actually kind of gasped out loud. I asked her why the sudden change of heart, and I never forgot how flat her tone of voice sounded as she shrugged her shoulders and said, "Time for a change, I guess." I cannot stress how unlike Lyra that was, and by that time, I was really starting to worry about her. But then I saw how she ate it. She didn't cook the ground beef she bought. She ate it raw, with her hands. She developed this habit of doing it late at night, too, like this one time when I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. I was heading back to bed when I heard the creak of the fridge door coming from the apartment's kitchen and sitting area. It was almost 3 a.m., and when I peeked around the door, I saw the moon was kind of pouring through the blinds, turning the floor into this sort of grid of shadows. And there was Lyra, too, standing at the window, just staring up at the moon. I stood there watching her silently until she swayed slightly, and then I sort of bolted back to my room. And the next day, I once again asked if she was okay or if there was anything she wanted to talk about. But she told me what I'm now quite certain was a lie, and she said she was fine. I told myself that she even got so much as a tiny bit worse, I was probably going to try and get her family involved and organize some kind of intervention. And then the next thing I knew, the insects started appearing. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the kitchen making toast when I heard a crunch behind me and turned. Lyra was sitting at the table, a mason jar in front of her, and inside of it were live crickets. I watched in horror as she reached inside. The cricket's legs were scrabbling against the glass, and she plucked out one with her fingers and threw it into her mouth. I froze. There was a butter knife tight in my grip, with a wet, brittle sound making my stomach drop. I turned back to the counter and smeared the butter on my toast and then walked out like nothing had happened. But then, when it happened a second time, I couldn't ignore it. A few days later, it was beetles, these big, shiny black ones. I found her eating them, standing by the sink, and this time I gagged, the sound slipping out before I could stop it. She didn't react, she just kept eating, but when I demanded to know what had gotten into her, she swallowed what was in her mouth and started speaking. She told me that she learned a thing or two about herself down in Bolivia, and that she decided to make some changes. And if I didn't want to try out her new diet, that was fine, but I wasn't about to dictate what she could and could not eat in her own apartment. She didn't sound threatening or anything, but again, seeing Lyra act even remotely confrontational was so unlike her that it actually freaked me out. And before long, the apartment didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like hers, like she'd claimed it. And her room started to stink, a very thick, earthy smell, like wet dirt and rot. And she stopped showering. Her hair was clumping into these greasy knots, and her clothes kind of hung off of her as she started to lose weight, too. I wanted to ask what happened down there, what she'd seen in that jungle, but every time I tried, something stopped me. I started locking my bedroom door. It was a very flimsy door, the kind that you could probably pop open with a credit card, but it made me feel just that little bit safer. I'd lie there, my phone under my pillow, listening to Lyra pacing around outside. Work became my lifeline. 8 hours at the coffee shop, steaming milk, wiping counters, and chatting with regulars who didn't know that my roommate was unraveling back home. Then, come the end of the day, I'd linger after my shift, nursing a cold latte and delaying the walk home, but I had to go back eventually. And when I did, there she'd be, sitting or standing by the window and either waiting for or staring at the moon. The next thing I remember is how she started covering up all the mirrors one day. I came home to find every single one in the apartment draped with towels or turned to face the wall, and that was also the day that I found scratches on the bathroom door, these deep gouges like she'd been clawing at it with something. She vandalized her own sketchbooks too, the ones that she used to fill with all of her pretty drawings. Pages had been torn out or crumpled up, and the ones that remained were covered in these strange charcoal scribbles that creeped me out just to look at them. And that was the point that I realized that she needed help. Very urgent help too, and the next day, once I got home from work, I was going to try and talk to her about getting some. If that didn't work, it was then time for Plan B, the intervention. But the horrible irony of all of this is that by the time I actually decided to act, it was already too late. The next evening, it was dark when I arrived home from work. Then when I unlocked the door, I walked into the apartment, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was sort of this wet and coppery smell, heavier than the beef had ever been. The apartment was dark, so I figured no one was home, but when I flipped the light switch, there was Lyra, sitting in the middle of the TV room, or at least what was left of her. She was sitting cross-legged, our big kitchen knife in one hand, a flap of her own skin in the other. She'd peeled it back from her face, starting at her forehead, and had pulled it down, like a mask. She looked at me, the raw flesh of her forehead glistening as blood dripped onto her thighs. And then, with lips that were streaked with red, she told me, "I need to see who's underneath." I dropped my bag and ran, screaming as I went. I made it to my room, slammed the door, and then pressed my back against it after locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone. Then I dialed 911 and told the dispatcher what was happening. And as I spoke, I could hear her out there in the hallway. That knife sounded like it was scraping against something, and she was muttering louder and louder, and then it stopped, replaced by a low, keening sound, like she'd finally realized what she was doing, or had only now just started to feel the pain of what she'd done to her face. I slid down on the floor, my knees pulled up with my finger in one ear and the dispatcher in the other, and just waited. I was shaking, but thankfully the cops got there fast. I heard the front door burst open as a boot hit the frame, and then after the distinct sound of the two cops shouting some commands, I heard this feral, inhuman snarl before the slap, slap, slap of bare feet on hardwood floor. There was another shout, a command to stop, and then 2 shots, sharp and loud. The shots were terrifying, but the silence that hung in the air afterwards was somehow even worse. By the time I unlocked the door, 2 EMTs were zipping Lyra up into a bag. Her face, or what was left of it, was turned toward me with one eye still open, cloudy and still. One of the cops asked if I was okay. I nodded in the moment, but I wasn't. I was more shaken up than I'd ever been in my whole life. I didn't stay. I couldn't. I grabbed my keys and my phone and drove to my friend Mia's place across town. She opened the door in pajamas and took one look at me and pulled me inside. I crashed on her couch and then told her everything in bits and pieces. My friend didn't say much. She just gave me a hug and handed me a blanket and let me sleep after assuring me that everything would be fine. A few days later, once the cops finished with the scene, we went back to the apartment. Me, Mia, and her boyfriend in the latter's truck. And we packed all of my stuff up in under an hour, and the landlord didn't fight me when I broke the lease. He'd already seen the bloodstains on the hardwood. I live with Mia now. Her spare room is small, just a twin bed and a dresser, but it's mine. And sleep was very tough for a while. I'd have nightmares about Lyra, crickets and beetles crawling out of her open mouth before her whole face split open, and I'd wake up sweating, and then lie there till the sun came up, wondering what she saw in that jungle and what she brought back with her. The cops called it a psychotic break and blamed the ayahuasca. I read for myself that it happens sometimes, and I guess it does make sense. But there are times at night that I still keep the lights on, and I still lock my bedroom door, and I still check the mirror before I sleep just to make sure that it's still me looking back. My name's Athena, and I started my home bakery business during the summer of 2020. I was furloughed from my job, and the boredom was killing me, so I took up baking as a way of keeping myself occupied. It was definitely a way of managing stress too, because I always made way too much for one person. But then delivering baked goods to family and friends always made for a great excuse to get out and stretch my legs. Whenever they gave me compliments on the things I delivered, I figured they were just being kind and showing gratitude. But when one friend told me that I could potentially earn money by turning my baking into a lockdown side hustle, I got to thinking. And at the time, the kitchen in my apartment was tiny, with the counter barely wide enough for a cutting board, but I made it work. I set up a few social media profiles, uploaded a dozen photos of my best brownies, blondies, and pies, and then asked the right people to share my page for the maximum audience. Part of me believed that there was no way that it would take off, not with all the super fast delivery services that people could use with just a few taps on their phone. But I was wrong, majorly wrong, and I discovered that in a world of faceless online middlemen offering discounted merchandise made half the world away, there was a huge demand for locally baked bread, cakes, pies, and pastries. The first week was slow but promising, and the easy scheduling helped me figure out the best methods of running my kitchen. But then over the week that followed, word of mouth and grassroots advertising resulted in my orders doubling, then tripling, then almost quadrupling over the course of 8 very productive days. And by week 3, I was having to place potential customers on a waiting list because my whole schedule was filled with either prep, proofing, or baking. And I'd gone from bored out of my mind to barely having a minute to myself. But busy hands meant happy hands, especially once all that extra cash landed in my pocket. I liked making the extra cash, and I liked having something to keep me from going crazy. But I quickly realized that I loved baking and running my own business more than anything I'd ever done before. Each and every day, my apartment was filled with the warm, yeasty scent of rising dough, baking bread, or caramelized sugar. Then, unlike my job in corporate, I got to see the results of my hard work right there in front of me, while the enthusiasm my customers exhibited was satisfying in ways that I never thought possible. 2 months in, I did a little calculating and realized if I worked on a 6-day schedule and raised my prices by just a small percentage, I could actually quit my job and bake full-time. Well, long story short, that's what I did, and for just over a year following, I was happier and more fulfilled than I'd ever been in my entire life. But then, right when everything was going smoothly for the first time in a long time, the fire came. It was the middle of the night in October of 2021, and I was dreaming of sourdough starters I had bubbling on my counter when the fire alarm suddenly woke me up. I fumbled for my phone just as I smelled burning, and then seconds later, I saw black smoke curling under my apartment's front door. I grabbed my shoes out of instinct, but I was so scared that I didn't bother putting them on. I ran barefoot into the smoky hallway and then stumbled out onto the street, coughing as flames licked up the side of the building. And by morning, the section of the building containing my apartment was a charred ruin, with blackened beams jutting from scorched brickwork that still dripped with hose water. And everything I owned was gone. My mixer, my baking sheets, my clothes, my books, all burned or soaked beyond saving. And I stood there in the dark of the early morning, clutching my phone and shoes, and wondered, what the hell was I going to do? But as usual, Mom had a solution. She lived in the same split-level house up in Somerville that I'd grown up in, one with faded yellow siding and a well-tended front yard. And the guest room still had my old twin bed, and she told me that I could stay as long as I needed if it meant finding the right apartment. We'd already talked it over, and I'd mentioned how if I found somewhere with a large and well-equipped kitchen, then there was potential for a huge increase in turnover when it came to my baking business. I was grateful for her patience while I rebuilt, so after picking up baking supplies and a few home essentials, I got back to work. Customers didn't care where I baked, so long as the bread was good. They'd pull up to Mom's driveway, I'd hand over their orders, and life kind of limped along. But I couldn't stay forever. I needed a place of my own, somewhere central enough that clients from across the city could reach me, with a kitchen big enough to handle my growing business. And I spent weeks hunting, sitting on my mom's couch, laptop balanced on my knees, scrolling through listings until my eyes literally hurt. Some places were too small and others were just too far out, and a few were perfect but priced beyond my reach. Then one afternoon, as rain was tapping against the living room windows, I found it, a listing for a place on Mount Vernon Street, just north of Boston Common. I knew that area from my teenage years when I had a job slinging pizzas at a joint on Charles Street. Mount Vernon Street was elegant and historic, lined with brownstones that glowed red-brown in the sunlight, and some had balconies with curling ironwork and others had wide windows that caught the last of the day's light. I loved it, and it was a major step up, a neighborhood that breathed old wealth and quiet pride, while the listing offered 2 floors, full amenities, and rent that didn't make me flinch. There was, however, a catch, a single line tacked on at the end. Potential tenants must be prepared to follow a strict set of terms and conditions. And I assume it was just standard stuff. No parties, no smoking, maybe a ban on pets, and that was all fine by me. My life was flour, ovens, super early mornings, not late-night chaos, so I called the number just minutes after spotting the listing. A woman answered. Her voice was very polished, and then after confirming I was calling about the apartment, she went into a big explanation. And after introducing herself as Evelyn, she explained that the house belonged to her family, who were looking for a tenant to share with her elderly cousin, Ethel, who had some rare condition that kept her frail and confined. I'd have the first 2 floors to myself, including a kitchen, a living room, and a bedroom, but the 3rd floor, where Ethel lived, apparently was a no-go zone. No knocking, no talking, no stepping foot up there. Break the rules, and I guess I'd be out in the streets, lease terminated instantly. Evelyn stressed that it wasn't about pettiness or control. It was about preserving Ethel's health and dignity in what little time that she probably had left. I wouldn't have to look after her. Nurses and assistants came and did that, and outside of calling in the event of an emergency, there was a chance Ethel and I might never cross paths. The setup sounded odd, but I kept hearing run of the house in my head. 2 floors and a prime spot for the price of 1 bedroom. It was just way too good to pass up. I told Evelyn I wanted to see it, and then we set up a time for the next day. When I arrived, the house was even more than I'd pictured it. It loomed on Mount Vernon Street, and its brick facade weathered but very stately, and the kind of place that had seen centuries pass without even blinking. The front steps were worn smooth. The door was a heavy slab of oak complete with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. I loved it. And inside, the 1st floor opened into a wide living room, a fireplace dominating this one wall, its mantel carved with vines that looked older than the city itself, and the rest of the house was just as opulent. But when I saw the kitchen, that's when I fell in love. It was a dream, spacious, with a gas range, a butcher block island, and cabinets that stretched to the ceiling. Upstairs, the 2nd floor had a bedroom with a bay window overlooking the street, plus a small office that I could use for paperwork. Evelyn met me at the door. This very thin woman with a flash of white hair and a face etched with very stern lines, and she didn't smile, but she didn't glare either. She let me through the house, her steps very slow, very measured, asking about my plans. When I mentioned the bakery, her eyes kind of softened, and she seemed relieved that I wasn't looking to turn the place into some kind of party house. I signed the lease that afternoon, Evelyn handed me the keys, repeated the rules about Ethel, and then left me to settle in. The first few weeks were good. Better than good, even. I had the kitchen set up, my mixer was humming on the island with flour dusting the counters as I worked, and the house was quiet, but I relished that, and sometimes I'd even forget that Ethel was even there at all. I heard her once, maybe 2 weeks in, a wet, rattling cough that drifted down from the 3rd floor, and it kind of startled me, the sound cutting through all that stillness, but I just sort of brushed it off. She was sick, and that's why the rules were there. And after that, I barely thought about her. My business occupied my mind almost constantly, and before long, the house felt like it was all mine. At least until I started to feel sick too. It came on kind of slow, a tiredness that slowly settled into my bones. I'd wake up sluggish with my legs feeling heavy, and no amount of coffee seemed to shake it. I blamed the hours, kneading dough at dawn, baking through the afternoon, packing orders late into the night. But even after I scaled back my operation to give myself some rest, it seemed to get worse. I'd end up napping on the couch, the oven timer ticking in the background, but I'd wake up even more exhausted than before. My jeans were starting to loosen around my waist, and my face started looking sharper in the mirror as the weight melted off of me. And I told myself it was stress, the months of grind and stress just catching up with me. But then my hair started to fall out. I'd find clumps in the shower, dark strands clogging the drain, more tangled in my brush each morning. My period stopped coming too, which is kind of TMI, which at first I tried to pin on the same exhaustion excuse, maybe even just me not eating enough. But when a customer called, voice was very tight with anger, saying that they found one of my fingernails in their banana bread, I couldn't ignore that anymore. I looked at my hands, saw brittle, yellowing nails and how one was missing entirely, and then felt a cold knot tighten in my chest. And obviously, I went to the doctor the next day. He was some stocky guy with graying hair and a clipboard that he kept scribbling on, and he asked about my diet, my sleeping habits, and what I did for work. But I also made sure to tell him about the fire, the move, and my new home. He kind of was just tapping his pen and said old buildings can sometimes hide things, be it mold in the walls, lead in the pipes, or even arsenic in the green covers of antique books. And he ordered blood work and told me to stay someplace else for a few days if things got any worse. Stay with a relative, he said, or check into a hotel and see if the symptoms fade. I nodded, promised I would, and then left with a slip for the lab. I went back to my mom's that night. She opened the door, took one look at me, and just gasped. "Oh my God, you look terrible," she said. I must have looked skeletal compared to the last time I'd seen her. I was pale, I had huge bags under my eyes, and my hair looked pretty patchy and dull. I was a far cry from the girl that put on a little weight thanks to getting sugar high on her own supply. And I was scared that I'd get worse, but after 3 days of convalescing in her guest room, I felt so much better. The nausea lifted, and when my strength crept back, I called Evelyn and told her I thought something in that house was making me sick. And she expressed her sympathy, but there was this very strangeness to her voice. She reminded me of the lease, how breaking it without proof would mean lawyers and fees. Subletting was an option, and she was more than happy to consider a doctor's opinion, but at the end of the day, we had an agreement. I should have stayed away. I know that now, but I loved that place so much that I talked myself into going back, just for one more night. I'd test it, prove it was the house, and if I felt worse, then I'd know for certain that I needed to leave. I drove back to Mount Vernon Street, and then the moment I stepped inside, the air had this very stale, heavy, with a sort of faint metallic quality that I'd never detected before. I told myself it was some kind of cleaning product Ethel's nurses had used, and now I think I know different. Stale air and chemicals or not, I resigned myself to stay at least one night, so I set my bag down and started a batch of dough to keep my hands busy. But by the evening, the nausea was back. I knew then that I'd be leaving in the morning for certain, but I was so exhausted that I thought driving might be dangerous until I'd slept and there was daylight. So I climbed the stairs to the second floor, feet dragging with each step, when suddenly I heard the sound of singing. It came from the third floor, this clear voice that cut through the silence. But it wasn't the voice of an old dying woman. It was young, alive, sounding out a melody that I didn't recognize. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, my breath catching as I listened. The sound was soft but sharp, and at first I figured it was a recording. But then there was pauses, breaths, the faint waver of a living throat. It wasn't a recording. This was clearly a human. Ethel was supposed to be bedridden, this husk of a person, so who the hell was up there singing? I remember my skin kind of prickling as I turned, shuffling back down the stairs before I grabbed my keys, my phone, and my jacket, and then ran for the door. I didn't care about proof, about leases, about anything. I wasn't staying. And that night, after driving back to my mom's place, I got sicker than I'd ever been. I vomited until my throat was raw and a blood vessel burst in my eye, leaving a red smear across the white area. And in the morning, I looked into the mirror and saw a stranger. My cheeks looked completely sunken in, my eyes looked hollow, and my hair was thinning so badly that you could actually see my scalp. I broke down, sobbing into my mom's arms, and told her everything. The house, the sickness, the singing, and she held me tight and told me everything would be okay and that we'd fight the lease together. We'd get proof, hire experts, and force Evelyn to let me go. But it didn't work. Nothing did. My blood work came back normal, no toxins, no allergies, nothing to explain what was happening to me. And we paid a hazardous materials guy to check the house too. This gruff man with a toolbox and a clipboard who spent hours testing the air, scraping paint, and sniffing for mold, and he found nothing. The place is old, he said, but safe and up to code. And the lack of evidence meant Evelyn wouldn't budge, and we ended up paying out the full lease. Thousands that I didn't have, borrowed from my mother and her boyfriend, just to be done with it. I moved back in with her, and within days I felt better again. The weight returned, my hair started to come back, and my energy was surging. Whatever was in that house, whatever it was doing to me, I guess it stopped. And I found a new place eventually, a much smaller apartment with a much smaller kitchen in the city's north end, and the bakery picked up, life steadied on, and I tried to move on. But that house on Mount Vernon Street wouldn't let me go, though. I remember lying awake some nights just staring at the ceiling, replaying this whole thing in my head. What was up on that third floor? Was it Ethel, somehow defying her sickness? Or was it something else? I'd dig online sometimes, late when I couldn't sleep, searching property records, old articles, anything about that house, and nothing turned up. No scandals, no deaths, just some blank slate. And the house just stood there, smug and silent, hoarding its secrets from me. And a few months back, I drove by the house. I remember it was a cold January evening and I was in the area for a delivery. I don't know why I did. Curiosity maybe, or possibly out of some unconscious desire to face it. And the house looked the same, the brickwork glinting faintly in the early dusk, with its windows dark and still. And I parked across the street. My engine was just idling and I sat there watching. The place stayed still for a while, just another quiet house on a quiet Boston street. And then suddenly, I saw a shadow, quick and thin, pass by a third-floor window. My hands tightened on that wheel and I floored it and sped away. I don't know what happened in that house, and I don't think I ever will either, but it wasn't my imagination. Something was wrong there, something that latched onto me and only let go when I fled. I'm safe now, happy even, but memories of what happened in that house back there still linger with me, and as long as that mystery persists, I don't think I'll ever be able to fully let go. From the very first moment I met him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with my friend's new roommate, Tommy. It was late summer, and my friend Danny had just moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment off campus. The building looked like it hadn't seen a fresh lick of paint since the 80s, and the stairwell smelled bad, and the hallway carpet was stained. But considering the rent and the proximity to campus, it was quite a find considering he needed nothing more than a place to sleep and study. I went over to help him unpack, hauling boxes up the creaky stairs with my shirt sticking to my back, and that's when Tommy appeared. He was leaning against the kitchen counter. His arms were crossed and he was just kind of watching us. He was a big guy, very wide too, with dark hair that hung just past his ears. Danny introduced me. "This is Tommy. He's cool, just quiet." Tommy nodded, a quick jerk of his chin, but he didn't smile, and he didn't say a word. I remember forcing a smile, mumbling hello, and went back to helping Danny move his stuff in. But I didn't like the look of him, and that never changed. Later, when we were alone grabbing pizza in the car, I brought it up. "Your roommate's kinda off, man," I told him. But Danny just laughed, in that loud, careless way of his. "Oh, Tommy's just not a big talker is all," he replied. "I mean, I guess he's a little weird, but who isn't?" He had a point, but I still wasn't sure. Something about Tommy just didn't sit right with me. But Danny was my best friend, and I didn't want to pester him over what amounted to just a gut feeling, so I let it go. And okay, time for a short history lesson before we keep going. Danny and I went way back, all the way to high school, and for as long as I'd known him, he was the kind of guy who could sleep through a tornado. Then, since this all happened before super loud cell phone speakers were a thing, cell phone alarm clock functions were nothing more than tinny two-tone beeps looping over and over. "Well, what about the vibration function?" I hear you ask. Couldn't Danny just put his phone on a desk and any other hard surface and then hear the super loud buzzing when the alarm went off? Not if he wanted to charge his phone overnight, because back then, and I'm sure some engineer type will explain why in the comments, but some phones quit vibrating altogether whenever they were plugged into a charge. And it was super first world problems, I guess, but the solution was simple. He bought an iPod docking station, one which featured an alarm clock function, and then he could blast himself with some Pantera music whenever he needed to wake up. However, that iPod station ended up being the punchline to half our jokes for a while, because even if he blasted himself with ear-splitting heavy metal music, he still didn't wake up half the time. It happened when he was sleeping over at my place one time, and he'd set up the docking station the night before to play music. It started blaring at like 7 a.m., and for the record, it was Pantera's song The Great Southern Trendkill, so it opens up with a guy growl screaming "Blurg" at the top of his lungs. And it woke me up startled, and I looked across the room expecting Danny to wake up in a similarly abrupt fashion, but he was sprawled out in his inflatable mattress like some starfish, still snoring as the screaming stopped and the guitar riffs kicked in. I threw a pillow at him and he woke up annoyed, like there wasn't ear-melting loud music playing right next to his head. I thought it was funny at the time, but looking back on it, there was probably a medical explanation for it. Maybe he was hard of hearing and no one ever put it together. But either way, Tommy didn't find it funny, and he didn't share our sympathy for Danny's condition either. Danny mentioned it maybe a week after moving in. "Tommy hates the alarm," he said, casual, like it was nothing. "It says it wakes him up and he can't fall back asleep when it does, and keeps giving me these looks about it." He chuckled. "I told him I'd use something else, but you know me." I did know him. He wouldn't find something else, or rather, it took Danny way longer than it should to get around to the little things like that. That iPad station had been screaming at him for years by this point, and he'd never once bothered to replace it or set it quieter. "Be careful, dude," I said, only half joking. "Tommy's one odd duck." Danny laughed again, and I was told I worry too much. But things got bad, fast. One night, Danny texted me about Tommy acting strange. It was a picture of a note on the fridge. "Silence is golden," scrawled in block letters with a black marker. Dude's got a flair for drama, Danny wrote, adding a laughing emoji. Then another time, he said Tommy had stood in the hallway outside of his room at night, not moving, just staring at the door. Caught him when I went for water, Danny texted. Freaked me out, but he just said that he thought he heard something. I told him to get out, find a new place at that point, to crash on my couch if he needed to. But he told me that things weren't that bad, especially not since the rent was so cheap. And I should have pushed harder. I should have shown up with a truck and dragged him out of there myself, but hindsight is always 20/20, I guess. It was a Tuesday when it happened. I hadn't heard from Danny all day, which wasn't like him at all because he usually sent me dumb texts that we'd crack up over later. But that day, my phone stayed silent, and by afternoon I was preoccupied with worry, checking it every few minutes for text messages or missed calls, but nothing came through. By the evening, the worry was eating at me, so I drove over to Danny's apartment and found the door was unlocked when I got there. By his own admission, Danny was a slob. He'd leave clothes everywhere, leave dishes piled up, but he wasn't careless, and he wouldn't leave his door unlocked. I stepped inside and found the living room was dark except for the flicker of the TV. I called out Danny's name, but got no answer as I moved past the cluttered coffee table with its empty beer cans and crumpled up chip bags and then into his bedroom. And I found him on the bed. Danny was sprawled out, one arm flung over the edge like he'd fallen asleep mid-snooze the way he always did. But the sheets were soaked red, a dark stain spreading out from under him and pooling on the mattress. Blood trailed down the side, dripping slow and steady onto the floor, where that damn docking station sat, smashed to pieces, plastic cracked, wires spilling out. Danny's throat was cut, a jagged, ugly gash that looked like it had been hacked open with something dull, not clean but completely ragged, like the skin had torn under the force. When I saw his eyes, staring at the ceiling, completely empty, I stumbled back with this tight feeling in my chest. And then I heard it, the creak of a floorboard coming from the hallway behind me. Tommy was there, standing just outside the door. His face was blank, no anger, no panic, just nothing, like it was waiting for a friggin' bus or something. He couldn't stop, he said. That noise, every morning. I asked him. I warned him. I froze, my brain screaming at me to run, to yell at him, to do anything, but my legs were rooted to that spot. He took a step closer, his shoes silent there on the carpet. I saw his eyes flick to the broken clock and then back to me. You heard it too, didn't you? He asked before saying, You know how it was. He took one more step towards me and I bolted. I don't remember deciding to, I just remember my body lunging forward and my shoulders slamming into the door frame before I slipped through. I hit the front door hard, fumbling the knob for a split second before it flew open and banged against the wall. Behind me, I could hear Tommy, not running but taking these slow, steady steps that echoed in the narrow stairwell. I made it to my car and my hands were shaking so bad I dropped my keys twice before I jammed them into the lock. I didn't look back until I was peeling out, and there he was, standing in the street, watching me drive off with that same empty look in his eyes. The cops picked him up later that night. I'd called them from a gas station a mile away, my brain so fried they had to keep asking me to repeat myself. They found Tommy in the apartment, sitting on the couch with the knife that he'd used to kill Danny sitting in the kitchen sink. He hadn't bothered to wash it. He didn't resist either, didn't fight. He just let the cops cuff him and take him away. They told me he kept muttering about the alarm, how it had to stop. Danny had been dead since morning, they said, probably killed right after that clock went off at 6 a.m. Tommy had sat there all day with him, waiting, just him and the body, the TV flickering in the background. I still think about Danny a lot, how he laughed off the notes, how he was too stubborn or stupid to see that danger. And I still think about Tommy too and how close I came to being next. That docking station was gone, smashed to pieces on the bloodied floor, but I still hear the sound that it made sometimes whenever I think about everything that happened. I had a weird childhood, so I was kind of a messed up kid. Not the kind that went out torturing cats or lasering ants to death with a magnifying glass. I wasn't that far gone. But me and my buddy Cooksey, we liked starting fires. It started small at first. We'd burn stuff in the alley behind his house, whether it was piles of dry leaves, old newspapers, or whatever else we could snag. And I remember the crackle of the flames, the way they danced over whatever we set on fire, and it really fascinated us. Then one day, we messed up big time. When we were 14, we torched a shed in some guy's backyard just to see how big the fire could get. We didn't mean for it to spread. We didn't mean for the wind to kick up and send embers flying into the backyard of the house next door, but they did, and they took off. By the time the fire trucks showed, half the block was swimming in a haze of black smoke, and we ran off, thinking that we'd gotten away with it, but it was just days before the cops came knocking on mine and Cooksey's door. We got arrested, dragged down to booking, the whole 9 yards. Then, after admitting what we did, and on account of our other run-ins with the law, we each got 9 months at a youth detention center, a fancy name for juvenile hall. Juvenile hall, or juvie as we called it, was rough as hell, believe it or not. The building was this concrete block in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by chain link fences topped with razor wire that was so sharp that it was shiny at night. And inside, it smelled like sweat, bleach, and something sour that you couldn't quite pin down. The walls were gray, and the lights buzzed constantly with this low hum that you never seemed to get used to. You'd wake up at 6, eat cold oatmeal for breakfast, and then it was either group exercise or group therapy sessions where they'd try to fix us. They'd feed us dinner, give us a little recreation time, and then it was lights out by 9 p.m. The other kids were a mixed bag. Some were okay, I guess. Guys I'd shoot hoops or trade snacks with, and a couple of them even became close friends. But then there were the other kids, the ones everyone else was afraid of. To their credit, they made it easy to work out who not to mess with, and if a kid was too weird or scary, you knew to either avoid them or treat them with kid gloves. But then there were the kids you didn't know that you needed to be scared of, and to me, they were always way more dangerous. Those first kids were like machine guns. They made a lot of noise, and you knew to keep your head down whenever they did. But then those other kids, the quiet ones, they were almost like landmines. You didn't know that you stepped on one until it was too late. And Adam, he was one of those. I got stuck with him as a roommate after about 4 months into my sentence. Our room was small, just 2 metal bunks bolted to the floor, a chipped sink in the corner, and a toilet that smelled bad no matter how much they scrubbed it. The window was little more than a slit way up high, letting in just enough daylight to remind you that the world was still out there. Adam showed up one afternoon escorted by a guard who dumped his stuff, a thin blanket and a plastic bag of clothes, on the bottom bunk. He was skinny and pale with greasy black hair that just kind of hung on his face and these dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in literal years. He didn't look at me at first. He just sat there hunched over staring at the floor, and I figured he was either shy or scared like most newbies were. But I was wrong. I could tell that he was weird almost right away because he didn't seem to sleep much. The first night, I woke up to the bunk creaking as he shifted and caught him sitting upright, staring at the wall all wide-eyed in the dark. And I thought that he just had the new fish blues, same as most kids got on their first night. But as it turned out, that was just Adam. I don't think he got more than a couple of hours of sleep a night, and it got so bad that it started to mess with my own sleep schedule. I'd lie there with a pillow wrapped around my head, trying to tune out the sound of him whispering things to himself in the dark. Hours later, I'd wake up exhausted with my eyes burning, and he'd be there, eyes completely fixed on that same spot with the same bloodshot, baggy-eyed stare. Adam wasn't the biggest fan of personal hygiene either. so much so that the room started to reek because of the stink that clung to his bedding. It smelled like sweat and unwashed skin mixing with the stale air, and I'd hold my breath whenever I walked past him just so I wouldn't have to smell it. One day, I couldn't take it anymore and I told him, "Dude, please, you gotta take a shower, I'm begging you, you stink, man." He didn't answer. He just slowly tilted his head like he was thinking it over, and then a few hours later he shuffled off to the showers. When he came back dripping wet, I was so relieved that I thanked him, but I spoke too soon. It took me minutes before I realized that somehow he still smelled bad, like he just stood there under the hot water without using any soap. The smell was bad, really bad, but far worse was the whispering. Adam talked to himself all the time in these low, scratchy murmurs that really grated on me. And by day it was annoying. He'd muttered under his breath while I tried to read the beat-up comics that were passed around. Stuff that I couldn't make out but couldn't ignore. But then at night, it turned very creepy. I'd wake up to it, faint and steady, like a radio left on in another room. And in the dark, with the shadows stretching across the walls, it sounded like something out of a horror movie. I'd squint at him through the gloom of the night and see his lips moving, and that constant hiss cutting through the silence made my goddamn skin crawl. I put up with it for weeks, until one night, when I snapped. I barely slept, my eyes were burning, and Adam was at it again, whispering in the dark. I just sat up, bunk squeaking, and said something like, "Dude, why do you always keep talking to yourself? It's driving me nuts." He stopped, and then slowly turned his head toward me like a puppet on strings. "I'm not talking to myself," he said. His voice was quiet but clear. "I'm talking to my little sister." "Then write her a letter or something," I replied. "Or call her. I don't care, just stop waking me up." Adam stared at me, unblinking, and told me, "She's dead." And his reply hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt bad, really bad. This horrible guilt twisting through my guts like a corkscrew. I'd lost people too. Not anyone like a sibling or anything like that, but I knew that it hurt. And I remember rubbing my eyes and sighing before I said something like, "I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean to upset you." But then, to my surprise, Adam let out this soft, high-pitched chuckle that somehow lacked any kind of joy to it. "It's okay," he said, adopting a tone that made me more and more nervous. "It's me who should be sorry." He didn't wait for me to ask. He just started talking with his voice low and steady like he'd been waiting to tell someone for years and years and years. Adam said that one day when he was 5 and his sister was 3, they'd been taking a bath together. They'd been splashing each other, arguing over some toy, the usual kid stuff, but Adam decided he'd had enough. He didn't want to have a little sister anymore. He didn't want her taking his toys, his space, his parents' attention. So, he bashed her head on the side of the tub to stun her, and then pushed her head under the water and held it there. She kicked and fought, her little legs thrashing while her feet smacked the sides of the tub. He held her there as she fought for her life, bubbles breaking the surface as water sloshed over the edge of the tub and soaked the bathroom floor. Her hands clawed at his arms, he said, her tiny little fingernails digging into his flesh. But Adam didn't let go. He watched her face under the water, eyes wide, panicking, mouth open in a scream that made no sound. After a while, his little sister stopped moving. She turned limp, floating just under the surface with her hair fanning out like weeds. Adam said he sat there, staring at her lifeless body until her mom walked in and started screaming. He told his parents it was an accident, that his sister had slipped, hit her head, and that he thought that she was just messing around until it was too late. He said his parents didn't want to believe he was capable of murder, so they swallowed his story hook, line, and sinker, and clung to it even, and then buried the truth with his sister's little coffin. The cops didn't do too much digging, not with Adam's parents covering for him. Little kids don't kill, they said. Not on purpose. Not like that. Besides, the poor girl's mom and dad had enough tragedy to deal with. Taking their only living child away from them just seemed cruel. And so, Adam got away with it. He walked totally free after drowning his own sister. No punishment, no record, nothing. And looking back on it, I think I just wanted to make sure that he wasn't a total monster, but I asked if he regretted it. And to my relief, he said yes. But that relief was short-lived. He didn't regret it because he missed her, and he certainly didn't regret getting all that sympathy over the years for being the poor little boy who watched his sister drown. He regretted killing her because now she wouldn't leave him alone. Ever since the day he drowned her in that tub, Adam's little sister had been following him around. He said he tried ignoring her at first and would pretend that he couldn't see or hear her, but that just made her mad. And when she got mad, she'd change. Adam said that whenever his little sister got angry, she'd stretch tall and thin, her limbs and face twisting into something sharp and hollow. She'd loom over him at night, silently screaming just like she had in the tub. So, he started talking to her, whispering just to keep her happy. He didn't mind if it made him look crazy because the alternative was far worse. After he finished his little story, I remember sort of sitting there, feeling the air get a little colder. Is she here? Right now? I had to force the words out, and then, in response, Adam slowly nodded before flicking his eyes toward the corner near the sink, and my skin prickled, every hair standing up. I looked to the corner, but there was nothing but shadows along with the faint drip of the faucet, and yet, like I said, the air felt heavier somehow. I barely slept that night. I just lay there listening to him whisper again, only this time it didn't annoy me at all. It terrified me. The next day, I went to talk with a counselor named Mr. Davies, this big guy with a buzz cut who didn't take any crap, and I found him in the rec room, asked to talk to him in private, and then told him everything, from Adam's story about his sister to the way he whispered in the middle of the night. Mr. Davies listened with this real serious look on his face. Then, when I was done, he nodded and said he'd handle it. They pulled Adam out of the rec room later that day. He and Mr. Davies talked for hours. I don't know what was said, but a few days later, Adam was gone. We later heard that he'd been transferred out, shipped to another center somewhere up north, but there was never any official explanation from the staff. I never saw Adam again, but along with a set of bedding that had been washed several times over just to get rid of his smell, he left behind his story. I got out just a few months later, determined to get my life together so I wouldn't have to bump into another Adam. I still have no idea if he ever told the truth about what happened with his sister, or even if that was the truth to begin with. But if he didn't just make it up to scare me, if he really did drown her in the tub like that, then I'd hate to think that he's out there, free to walk among us, still hearing the whispers of his long-departed sister. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams where I scream about nonsense every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, the left lane is for crime.